Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the briefing room. I'm your host, Abu Hamza. Today, we'll be discussing perceptions. Perceptions of ourselves as a society, as a community, and as a nation. What is our place in the world? And what is the Somali role in Africa in terms of our identity? I mean, how many of us even consider ourselves to be African? And what does it mean to be African? I mean, what are our roots and have we lost them? I mean, I believe that for far too long we have been conforming to the first, second, and third world framework that the Western world has imposed on us. Now, beyond that, we'll delve deeper into what the Somali role is in East Africa when it comes to the relations with our neighbours. I mean, socially, politically, and economically. Now, joining me on today's show is Hamza Egab. He holds a degree in English law, an MPA in governance, policy, and strategy development, and was the policy research officer for community safety at Southern Council. Now, moving back to Africa, he is still the chief editor at the Weekly Moral and is also now the director at the Honey Tree and Apple Farms in Nairobi, Kenya. Now, in his spare time, he blogs on 365 Inside Africa, .blogspot.co.uk. Now, welcome to the show. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the briefing room. How are you, brother Hamza?
Wa alaikum assalam, Abu Hamza. Jazakallah khair. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. So you're in Nairobi right now, and obviously just tell me a little bit about the Honey Tree and Apple Farms. It's something that's quite interesting. Just give me a bit of background to it.
Okay, it's something that I've been working on now since I've been here for about a year and a half. I've always thought of farming as being a way out for our generation. You know, we tend to think that economics is only centered around working in banks, you know, the high posts, but we actually negate to think about back home and, you know, what we could do with all that land that we have sitting around. So I did a little investigation into farming. Well, it wasn't little, about 5 years. And then, so 5 years of theory and then now 1 year and a half of actual practical. So alhamdulillah, it's going well. And hopefully we shall reap the fruits of our labor.
Inshallah. No, that to me is quite inspiring because there's loads of us who say like, yes, we want to go back to the motherland or we want to go back to Africa, and there's things that we do, but it seems that anytime one of us goes back, from our parents' generations, when they go back, they either set up some businesses, and some of our younger generation do the same, or you go into politics. And there's not many who actually say, you know what, I'm going to go into agriculture. You know, they go open up a shop or a petrol station or some other form of business, some trade, import, export business,
Yes.
or they get involved with the political side of Somalia or the Somali territories.
Yes.
So it's quite refreshing to see somebody obviously who thinks, you know what, no, I'm just going to do something a little bit different. And that is what I wanted to touch on because it's the perceptions that we have, and within that I like to sort of say, like, it's the perceptions that we have when we're abroad, and how we think of Africa, as well as those who are at home. Really, I mean, we are very nationalistic when it comes to any sort of Somali region or Somali countries that we have. But in terms of Africa, you don't see many Somali people actually promoting or having some sort of nationalistic pride towards Africa. And why do you think that is? I mean, is that because do we see ourselves as African, or do we see ourselves as being not African?
It's an interesting question. First of all, I think you hit the nail on the head at the very first instance where you said it's down to perceptions. And for instance, when I decided that I was going to go into farming, you know, it raised a lot of eyebrows. And people, you know, people still joke about it until today, you know. But alhamdulillah, you see, the thing is, we do have an identity crisis on the continent as a whole, not only centered around the Somali community, but not only you know, not centered around the people of Somalia, but I've noticed it throughout the whole continent. And it seems that we're lacking something to do with ourselves, in the sense whereby we don't actually look at what we have to try and build on that. What we tend to do is we try and look at the communities around us and see how we can basically mold ourselves into those communities. Now that raises a problem. The
When
problem
when
is
you
that
when you say communities, do you mean African communities or do you mean other international communities?
it depends where we're living. I think the Somali community, the people of Somalia, have a very resolute and they have this innate ability to quickly adapt.
Hmm.
So that in a way is a plus, but at times it's also detrimental. Like I said, it depends on the societies that we live in. If you have communities living within other African states, then you tend to see a shift towards that cultural or that way of life. And seeming also for those who live in countries like in the West, you tend to try and assimilate yourself. So the reason why we try and do that might be something we need to question, but it is happening, but we refuse to acknowledge it.
But is that now when you say obviously when we assimilate, is this because one have we lost our roots,
Yes.
and if so, what are our roots? Because there's so many people who argue, okay, listen, yes we are African or no we are not African, and we argue about our roots and our culture having been influenced so much, and you got the whole what they term as the Arabization of our culture and the Arabization of our roots, where too many of the things that we do nowadays is stems or is too rooted in the Arab culture and not necessarily the Somali culture, and that we've assimilated that. So what's your opinion on that, and how do you see that changing, or is that even the way it's supposed to be?
To be very honest, for instance, today I had my extended relatives around me, and for my family, basically half of my family has always been born and raised in Kenya. So I had my 19-year-old cousin around me, and I asked him a question. I said, "Do you identify as an African first, or as a Somali?" And his reply was quite interesting because he said, "I am firstly Somali." And then he said, "Then I am African." But this child, I mean, this young man does not even speak a word of Somali.
Mhm.
So, in a sense, you can say, yes, we do have pride in the fact that we try and keep our identity. But you need to understand is that we can put it down to 3 points. We can say there's this global culture that's present right now.
Mhm.
There's a global culture that is present. It is found within every generation. And it depends, well, in Africa, it's more vivid simply because those who follow that culture are those who are, let's say, who have lived or experienced or absorbed other cultures. Now, with the Somali community, because of the war, a lot of the population within the country shifted all over the world. So we've picked up so many different types of attributes and assimilated it within, tried to bring it, not for us to try and join that culture, but for that culture to try and dilute ours. I don't know if you understand what I mean. It's
Yeah,
like,
but it's within that. It's just the ones that have gone abroad, or the ones that are at home. And the reason why I asked this is because
yes,
I see our culture shifting. I mean, and I'll go backwards, where
yes,
people complain of too much Arabization now, and obviously the Arab culture coming into it too much.
yes,
Then if you look back 30 years ago, 40 years ago, where quite a lot of people celebrate the liberalism that was going on within the Somali regions, and again that was picked up mainly from the Russians and the other Western countries, and obviously the British and the French, where
yes,
that liberalism picked up, and obviously with the culture of TVs and music videos coming out, and a lot more parties coming out, and people celebrate those eras. And then
yes,
if you go back a little bit further, you have something where Sufism
yes,
influenced the Somalis a lot. And then when we look at Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan,
yes,
he was obviously one of the most the biggest sort of conveyors of Sufism. So
yes,
I see our culture shifting all the time with outside influences, and that makes
yes,
it very difficult for myself to then think, okay, what are our roots? And
yes,
everyone that complains about, okay, what we are right now, some people might be complaining right now there's too much Arabization, whereas 40 years ago people might be saying, you know what, there's too much liberalism, there's not enough Sufism, whereas And then you can't, it's very difficult to be a Sufi right now in any of the Somali regions because
Yes.
it's seen as something else again. So what are our roots? I mean, have we assimilated too much and diluted our roots too much?
To be very honest, one thing that I honestly believe right now, and this is something that has grown on me since I've been here. For instance, in Kenya, when I say the global culture, I mean you can find people dressed in Kenya as they are dressed in the UK, like the same age group. You know, they dress the same way, they talk the same way, their lifestyle or their approach to life is the same way. So you need to ask yourself, is it those who are touched by certain elements such as globalization, you know, the evolution in the way we live in mankind? Could you say that it's globalization? Could you say that it's basically the fact that the younger generation don't have something to identify as their own culture? And as a human being, we hunger to be accepted. We hunger to be accepted within the communities that we immediately find ourselves in. So you could break it down to three things. Okay, one could be the war issue, and the second one could be globalization. Thirdly, and I think that's something that needs to be addressed not only by the people of Somalia but the continent in itself, is class. Class is playing a big role in shaping how we view each other within our communities, how we interact with each other, and it's becoming more and more apparent. What I mean by, like for instance, the global culture, we can watch shows in Nairobi that you're watching in London, that's been watched across the Atlantic, the Far East. So that's one thing. We happen to hear the same music. So you need to look at it as class, in the sense whereby those people who can afford to gain these luxuries, you know, they have a certain culture, whether they are Somali, whether they are Kenyan, or whether they're South African. Those who do not have that wealth or who don't share that luxury would basically have the culture that they build for themselves within their own communities. So you could say they're more pure and we're more tainted because we have a wider scope of absorption.
If I understand this correctly, and I'm very much paraphrasing this into one sentence, is if your argument is correct, it basically means the poorer you are, the purer your culture, and the richer you are, the more access you have to globalization.
Not necessarily. What I mean by absorption is there are certain people, for instance, there are people who are in the middle, you can find them all over this continent, extremely rich in their lifestyle, extremely rich, but they have not had that, let's say, well, let's call it the globalization or the global culture infiltrate their inner circles.
Okay.
Do you understand? So it necessarily doesn't fall. You could say the people who are poorer tend to be more pure in the sense whereby they don't have all these distractions. They're more focused on basically living for today. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So they don't have time to be distracted by all this television, to be distracted by debates that we have that we can watch on TV or on online.
But
so there's a lot of yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, it's just like, but within that, don't you think that if we are going to try and find what our roots are, or the purer forms of our roots, is it then those people that we need to then go to and give them some form of employment to then find out what our roots are? Because I feel that there hasn't been done, like, enough research hasn't been done on it right now. I appreciate that the written version and the Latin written version of the Somali language only happened since 1972. And as an oral society, I appreciate that a lot of it has been spoken about, and obviously stories are passed on through generations. But with us now living here in the diaspora, and in many of the ones back home, obviously, as you say, impacted by globalization, if the younger generations are more on the internet and more focused with what's going on around the world, then listening to the stories that our parents used to teach us, how else can we bring back what perhaps can be a purer form of our culture? So we can clearly identify, you know what, yes, that is Somali, and these are the Arab influences, these are the Kenyan influences, these are the white Western influences, these are the Russian influences, these are the Chinese influences. So we can identify what we had as a culture before and identify what parts we've assimilated into the culture.
I'd like to ask you a question on that.
Okay.
Do you think in this present time that we have a culture as a Somali people? Do we have a culture other than the ceremonial culture?
I believe we have a culture, whether we can call it the Somali culture is a separate
thing. We do have something that we follow, and you see these things change. For example, if I go back to what I was saying about class, you have the first world, you have the second world, and you have the third world. Africa is considered the third world. When you have a young person who's grown up in the first world, the developed world, so to speak, and has absorbed that from day one, do you believe that when he comes back and he sees, let's say for instance, we are able to decipher and come back with our pure culture, do you think he'd be able to see that as something of worthwhile, coming from the third world?
You know what? That is a perfect place to just stop. We're just going to take a break. We'll be right back, and then we can continue, because I do really want to touch on the first world and the third world perspectives on this. So obviously for everyone else, we'll catch you right after the break, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the briefing room. I'm your host, Abu Hamza, and with me I've got Hamza Egal. Just before the break, we were discussing perceptions and identity for Somalis, is obviously how we identify as Somalis with Africans or within Africa. And we touched on the first world and the third world. And what I really want to go into is how that perception of us in the first world looking towards Africa, how will that help us or hinder us when we try to get involved with Africa as a continent? And how can Somalia get involved with, how can Somalia get involved with the development of Africa? And how has the AU been involved, obviously, with us?
I think when we're talking about the AU, I honestly believe at this current moment, they are overrated. There's an element of corruption. People who used to fund it, like Gaddafi, are no longer there, so finances have dwindled. But in my opinion, is they failed when it comes to African matters. We've been unable to attend to whether it's Mali, Chad, South Sudan. The AU is the first one to seek outside intervention from the former colonialists. And in my opinion, that is basically them deferring what they were their role on the continent.
But how do we, if that's the case, I mean, currently AMISOM is in Somalia. So if we can't trust on them and get them to, or if we can't believe in them to support us, how do we trust that the work that they're doing in Somalia right now is going to be good work, is going to be for our benefit?
Yes.
How can we trust them to provide security for a whole country?
AMISOM right now is basically moving without any direction or any coherent plan for the future when it comes to developing security in Somalia. They're purely there to safeguard external entities and the fragile government. When we're talking about finances, is that AMISOM is getting paid from the Somali coffer. Therefore,
what do you mean when you say the Somali coffer?
This is money that was is given to Somalia, whether by loans or donations, and this is what AMISOM is using to finance its mission in the country. That mission does not have a coherent plan for the future in terms of security or in terms of helping develop security. It's just there to secure small entities within Mogadishu, to be very honest, and other small regions in the country. I think
I mean, when you say that they're protecting the interests of obviously of externals and certain entities. When we speak about AMISOM, Ethiopia has only recently joined AMISOM. Kenya had only joined AMISOM as well a few years ago. But if Kenya and Ethiopia had invaded Somalia separately from AMISOM coming in, and then obviously have later joined to then try to legitimize themselves. So how does that bear on our relationship with our neighbors?
You see, Ethiopia, we have a long history of war with Ethiopia. Ethiopia is currently one of the most funded countries in Somalia, in East Africa, or you could say in Africa in general, because they're very involved in this proxy war, whether it's with Eritrea, whether it's with Somalia, whether it's with Sudan, Egypt, as far as the Nile. So right now, Ethiopia is basically playing to the flute of the imperialists. When it comes to now our specific relationship, I think it's aiding the lack of governance, the corruption. It comes down to resources, as we had mentioned before. So Ethiopia is detrimental. Kenya and Uganda are very, I'm not too sure. I think Kenya, there was an instance whereby we were talking about land going towards Kenya. So borders being redrawn again, which we know is already problematic. So we need to be honest with each other as African neighbors, whether we can deal with each other well, or we can try and develop together as a whole, or we basically end up being proxies for someone else's war.
But right now, I mean, Ethiopia, I know we've had a very long history with, and Kenya, we've had a more recent history with. But, I mean, when we talk about the Dadaab, for example, Kenya's been holding the Dadaab for 20 years. They
Yes.
hold so many of our refugees.
Yes.
You've got the refugee camps in Ethiopia as well, where there's loads of Somali people. So in terms
Yes.
of being able to house and home our refugees, I mean, that must be some of the good things that they're doing for Somali, right? Or for the
Yes,
Somali
I
people.
mean, I mean, when we look at the Somalis who are in Dadaab, yes, Dadaab is a refugee camp. Let's not divert from that. Yes, it's a place that was set up as an emergency relief. But I mean, when it comes to now education, people in Dadaab are gaining education. They're able to work. They're making some kind of finances. You know, there's an economic system that's developed there. I think only history would tell whether this thing was detrimental or not. This goes into the question of whether people should return home. You need to ask yourself seriously. There is no connection between the people of Dadaab and Somalia unless it's through strife and pain. So that connection is one reason why people wouldn't want to go back home to Somalia.
But when you say go back home, I mean, there's loads of people who apply for citizenship in
Yes.
Kenya and in Ethiopia, and we have a
Yes.
lot of Somali Kenyans who live
Yes.
there as well.
Yes.
So when you say return home, what is home? Is Kenya going to be their home? Is Somalia, even though they identify as Somalis,
Yes.
what will be their home?
I think
Do
the
they
debate-
think that Eastleigh is their home, or is it going to be actually, wherever region in Somalia I was from is my home?
I think the debate, the jury's out. People who want to go back, people who want to stay. Like I said, people who have a severed connection with the country would not want to necessarily go back. Those who still have relatives, or I wouldn't be surprised if we hear of a grandparent in Dadaab, born in Dadaab. I wouldn't be surprised at this point. These are people that have been there for 3 generations now. You have people who are born and having children there, and their children will go on and have children, and the status quo still remains. So what connection would they have with Somalia? And what connection would they have with Kenya? Because where Dadaab is located is a completely isolated place. So that is something that we need to, I think, in my opinion, and to divert a little bit, is that we were small cities before, we were small communities before we became countries. And I see us reverting to that system.
But and this is what I believe a lot of our issues lie as well. It's previously we, as you say, have always been smaller communities, or we've been smaller kingdoms, or smaller regions and countries, and we are now fighting over political borders that were not drawn by us.
Yes.
And that in itself is an issue. I mean, we are fighting over things that I believe the imperialists and the colonialists have left behind. And they've drawn borders within our communities, and that's what we're still fighting over. We're fighting over parts of lands that perhaps we need to restructure and redraw to make it more homogenic to our people, as well as to the other communities. So how do we resolve those disputes?
To be honest, that is a completely different debate in itself. What I can definitely say is that so long as we are involved in these proxy wars, we'd have security issues throughout the region, whether it's Westgate, Nairobi, whether it's Mogadishu that we constantly hear of people basically
But
blowing themselves up.
There's a lot of issues when it comes to Westgate. I mean, as soon as Westgate happened, a lot of people died, and obviously it was a very unfortunate incident. But
Yes.
straight after that, the first people who felt the impact of Westgate, aside from the people
Yes.
who were at Westgate, were the
Yes.
people who were at the dam.
Yes.
I mean, we had a lot of people, obviously, from the Kenyan authorities go over there and harass the Somalis that were in Dadaab. I mean, what is your knowledge on that? And
Not
what do you know
only
happened?
Dadaab. I mean, as soon as Westgate happened, a group of us, after the 5 days of what the ruckus that was happening, that we later found out that was inadequately reported or falsely reported by the authorities, was that the people who are ethnically Somali were already feeling the panic before the whole issue was over, before they even realized who it was. We, as the Somali community, already felt the heat, and people were being interviewed on BBC and saying Somalis need to go back home. So we mobilized. I mean, as soon as we were able to move around freely and that we knew the whole incident was over, we mobilized and we tried to stem that flow of the backlash. And it came. Like I said, young men who are from refugee camps would try and come into the city in Nairobi to gain a livelihood. So they would buy fake IDs. You know, it's a very corrupt system. So they were buying IDs. This was aiding corruption in Kenya. You know, it's a systematic thing. So these people were the first targets of the security. And they really suffered the brunt. Isli, where the Somali community is built its own establishment, was one of those places that suffered. Other areas, let's say, were Jir, Garissa. You know, these are also ethnically Somali areas, and these suffered a lot of security crackdowns.
If we can't trust each other with that, I mean, if we have such a long relationship between the Somalis and the Ethiopians, and the relationship between the Kenyans and the Somalis are not very well, how can we play a role when it comes to the development of Africa, and also in terms of, as a people, the movement, as a society, the movement of Pan-Africanism? I mean, what role do we play with that?
Unless we are self-sufficient and we are no longer being controlled with the use of aid, then we will be able to settle our differences as brothers and sisters on the continent. Until we are able to basically produce our own systems or manufacture our own ways of governance or of industries, that is the only way we'll be able to thrive. Nobody gives money to anyone for no reason, unless it's charity. And we don't believe in charity anymore. The whole of humanity doesn't believe in charity. So as long as we're basically being given cash in order to basically deal with policy, when it comes to not only within our borders, but our external borders, the external areas, our immediate neighbors. So unless we're able to basically come together and realize that our strength is in our collective and not in separating ourselves, we won't be able to help each other out in any way whatsoever. So it comes down to finance.
But when you say coming together and doing things collectively, do we have to first come together as Somalis only, or do we have to come together as East Africa? I mean, when you talk about
as Africa, I mean, Africa supplies 16% of the world's electricity, 16%. Yet, in developed countries such as Kenya right now, we tend to have a complete blackout of 2-3 days sometimes, and people have to have generators in their houses. So we need to be able to think about what is good for us as a collective, as a continent, the way the Europeans have, the way the far Asian countries have.
But how do we do that? Because the way it's sometimes perceived, it's when it comes to proxy wars that we spoke about earlier, that the imperialists or the colonialists have still got so much influence within the continent, and not just necessarily with the people, but they have influence within the government. I mean, some of the people that the colonialists or the imperialists left behind to gain power after they left are still in power. There's a lot of people who they have raised, that they have brought up within their systems, and that they have assimilated into their culture and their way of thinking, that they have then installed as heads of government. So when facing such obstacles, How do we come together?
We need to ask questions about our governance system as a whole, as a continent. What is our governance system in general? And the reason I say this is because even the so-called democracies that we have on the continent are all copy-paste. Majority of the policies that we have in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of agriculture, in every aspect of a society, we tend to copy-paste.
Copy paste how?
Maybe we could say,
Where are we copying and pasting from?
for instance, this thing that we call an elective democracy, this is not, it has never been an African product. It's never been. We've always had, like, for instance, we've had committees of elders as the leadership and who would pass judgments. But now what we have is basically a political elite, like you rightly put, that has been educated in a system that even the common man in Africa does not understand. So that in itself is a problem. If I don't understand the way I am being led, or what my rights are, or how I can basically stand against any injustice, then I am basically what we consider basically the peasants. And that's what Africa is basically dealing with. We have political elites, we have those who are financially well off, the middle class, and then we have the peasants. And this is typical of England in itself, in the medieval, in the land, when basically we were talking about landlords. You know, we had peasants, we had now the landlords who were the middle class, and then we had the elites who basically ruled the country the way they felt. And that's what we have in Africa. These are systems that we have adopted from our colonial masters, past colonial masters. And unless we basically have the mentality and the courage to say, you know what, let us change direction. Let us see if we can come up with our own way of life or our own way of governance, then we will prevail. Let's think about agriculture first of all. Let's feed ourselves. If we're able to feed ourselves, then we won't wait for bags of rice to come from our white savior, so to speak.
You know what? I agree, and this is where I'm going to have to sort of cut you off because we're running out of time a little bit. But I do sincerely hope that we do change our mentality and that we do stop adopting and assimilating things from other systems that are not indigenous to ourselves. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming on to the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. We hope to have you on the show again soon. We'll be following your blog as you go along. And for everyone else, thank you very much for watching The Briefing Room. I'm your host, Abu Hamza, and I hope you have a very good evening.